Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you're watching. As we know, we have an international audience. My name is Mike Krupa, and I am your friendly neighborhood host of the Votum TV Heretics podcast, where we love to talk to people who have a dissident opinion, especially from the West, and present it to our audience on the international stage, and especially our Polish watchers. As we know, the typical Kowalski here in Poland needs to hear things that he doesn't hear on the regular tube, the television, or in the newspapers. So we're very happy to have today with us the great Laurie Spencer. Now, you have a fairly brief bio of Laurie in the description box, but I will read a more expanded one here for you. So Laurie is a radio personality and journalist. She is the American correspondent for Maverick News. She also currently co-hosts the Strange Bedfellows podcast on the U.S. Tour of Duty network. By the way, that's the same network that Scott Ritter does his usual program. So Laurie is well connected, so to say. Laurie is a veteran reporter and anchor with more than 35 years of experience in print and broadcast newsrooms. Her work has appeared in numerous daily and weekly newspapers, magazines, and online news portals, including Yahoo News, Counterpunch, Truth Out, This Can't Be Happening, and Op-Ed News. She can be seen regularly as guest commentator on The Kim Iverson Show and the mother of all talk shows with the great George Galloway from the United Kingdom. We all love George. Laurie is also, and this is how I came to know Laurie on Twitter, thanks to her great threads. She is a JFK historian who has devoted decades to study of John F. Kennedy's presidency and is currently a volunteer on the 2024 presidential campaign of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. All the links to Laurie's essentials are in the description box. Give her a like, give her a follow on Twitter. Laurie, how are you doing this morning, in essence, out there in good old Oklahoma?
It's a stormy morning. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning.
We had 11 tornadoes here in Oklahoma yesterday. It's springtime in Oklahoma. It's just what we do. This is Tornado Alley. And tonight we've got big storms this morning. If they flash a tornado warning, or if the lights go out or my internet goes out, guys, I just wanted to warn you that we've got very severe weather in the area. But for now, we're good. We're connected. So here I am talking to you in Poland, all the way from Oklahoma.
Indeed, the beauty of technology. So it's twister season, in essence, in Oklahoma. But we're seeing storms not only in the natural world, but we're also seeing storms in the political world, and not only on the geopolitical stage, but a lot of interesting developments are taking place in the United States. I want to head right into it. Laurie, you mentioned in one of our correspondences that in 2008, you had a love for Ron Paul, who I interviewed recently on our podcast, but you were also trying to get RFK Jr. To run then. If you could bring us some background, and then we'll deep dive into the current situation with RFK. But it seemed that you were prophetic in 2008, and who knows, in a parallel history, a Ron Paul RFK ticket. Wow, that'd be something beautiful.
Awesome. Yeah, I was kind of dreaming of something like that back in 2008, actually. Well, you probably can't see, but on my wall, I have a couple of pictures from back then of me and Bobby Kennedy. Like this is 2007, 2008. After 8 years of Bush, I felt even then that Bobby was the guy to save America. And so I was part of a draft Kennedy campaign and pestered the hell out of him to try and get him in the 2008 race. But the time, looking back, the time just wasn't right for Bobby. His kids were still pretty young, considering how he lost his father and grew up in a family of 11 kids. He had 6 kids, and he really wanted to be there for them, which I totally respect. I think that was the right choice at the right time for all the right reasons. And, also the momentum of Barack Obama. If you remember what it was like in 2008, they held Obama up as the second coming of JFK.
Of Jesus, in essence. Of Jesus.
And Jesus, too, yeah. I'm not even sure that a Kennedy could have competed with that. So I don't think he was willing to challenge Obama or Hillary Clinton in 2008 because he's a longtime friend of Hillary's. He endorsed her 3 times. Which I wasn't real happy about, to be honest with you. But Bobby and I don't agree on everything. We agree on most of the big stuff, though, and that's what's important. But I feel like now the time is right. His kids are grown. His only Democratic challenger is the President of the United States, the least popular president that we've seen in more than 40 years since Jimmy Carter. I think he's got a really good chance if we have a fair primary system. I think he could overpower Joe Biden quite handily next year. I hope he does. So I'm a volunteer on the campaign. I was first on board. Couldn't wait to do this. I've been waiting since 2008. So now that he's ready, I'm ready. Let's go. Let's win.
Well, it really is a historical moment if you consider also that this year we're going to have a fairly big anniversary of the assassination of his uncle.
Yeah.
And what I've noticed as I've researched into him, because during COVID, I heard of a Children's Defense Fund. I would look on the website. I knew he was crusading against all the BS with Bill Gates, the lockdowns, and so on. That made an impression. A lot of people in Poland also took notice that, hey, there's a Kennedy here. And usually, the Kennedy family is known for mostly, I'm not talking about Bobby and JFK, but the latter, so to say, family. They go with the flow. They even published that letter that, hey, he's the black sheep of the family. He's going a little bit nutty over there. He's going to cost lives and so on. And I've noticed that he's been, over the years, as I traced his political activity, he's been red pilled in many respects, which is a good thing. And I read this interesting article, chat. If you can check the Tablet magazine, the title of the interview is called "The RFK Tapes." A really fascinating interview. It goes on for quite some time, so it's an hour read, I would guess.
It's really good. I read that one.
But that so far, that is the best deep dive that I've seen into what he really thinks. And a lot of people were saying, "Oh, he's going to avoid, the lockdown issues and the vaccine issues." But no, he takes it straight up, which is really good. So, and I've heard this interesting statement recently that from a lot of well, maybe not a lot, but a few Trump voters, that the heart says Trump, but the head says Bobby. What do you think?
I think that would be very wise for them to consider Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
And I must tell you that the Libertarian Party, I've been a Libertarian for 27 years. I left the Democratic Party in 1996 because of the Clintons. The Clintons and their ilk destroyed the Democratic Party. I was a Kennedy Democrat all my life, from the time I was a child. And I felt that those ideals had been lost in the Democratic Party. So I left a long time ago. And voting for Bobby next year, when I have to change my voter registration to Democrat so I can vote for him, I'm not going to lie. That's going to be painful for me, Mike. That's really going to hurt. First time I voted for a Democrat in 27 years, but I vote for the person, not the party. And in 2016, I supported Trump wholeheartedly because I wasn't very impressed with Gary Johnson, the Libertarian nominee.
Yeah.
I wanted to like Trump. I wanted Trump to be everything that he promised to be, to take on the deep state, to, free the JFK files. That came up on Trump's watch. He let us down. He let me down on Syria. He let me down on Assange. He had Julian Assange arrested and then refused to pardon him when he had opportunities to do so. Trump let me down during COVID when he locked down the country, when he didn't fire Dr. Fauci, he didn't fire Francis Collins, when he hired representatives from Big Pharma to be in his administration, guys like Scott Gottlieb and Alex Azar. So I could go on. And Trump also let me down on Russia. One of the reasons that I supported Trump in 2016 was that Hillary Clinton was going to take us to World War III with Russia. I wanted peace with Russia, and that's what Donald Trump was saying he was going to do. And then he gets elected and he turns around and ramps up the Cold War rhetoric and starts sanctioning the hell out of Russia and arming Ukraine to the teeth. And they impeached him for it because he wasn't giving enough money and weapons to Ukraine, but he was still arming Ukraine. And, I'm glad that someone else has come along because I wasn't looking forward to another matchup between Biden and Trump And I know I'm not alone. Most Americans agree with me. They were begging for some other third option, or a viable candidate, and Bobby Kennedy is that man.
I think to a lot of the Democrat establishment, he's sort of like the Spanish Inquisition from Monty Python. Nobody expects Bobby Kennedy to all of a sudden jump into the race, right? But there he is, and he's doing
Right.
pretty good. I'm seeing polls from about 10 to 14%. I've seen one apparently 20% already among Democrats.
Yes,
So he's
sir.
making a pretty strong start.
Mhm.
But somebody will say, yeah, but anybody would have a strong start against Biden. Well, it's growing, which is a good thing. But going back to Trump in 2016, actually 2015, a little bit of personal history here. When he came down that escalator, made that speech, after a few weeks, and the crowds that I was seeing, I said to a lot of people in Poland, Trump's going to win the presidency. What are you talking about? Trump's
Mm.
going to win the presidency. It's going to be Jeb Bush against Hillary Clinton. I don't know. You'll see.
Mhm.
Trump's going to win the presidency. The momentum was
Right.
building up. I had an interview with a Polish news portal about 3 weeks before the election. And they asked me again, how is he going to win? I said, Wisconsin, Rust Belt, that's the map to victory. I got a lot of thank yous and a lot of sorries after the election, but there was something there. I just, because the timing was perfect. It was what Bannon said at one point. He was providential in the sense that those issues were lying on the street and nobody picked them up. So he gets into the White House, and then the problems begin because, as Scott Ritter said, many of you may recount his discussion with when he was in Washington recently, and they had that anniversary meeting on the INF Treaty, and he said, yes, that a person from the administration, anonymous person, said, yeah, we could implement arms control, but what was the term he used? The mid-level bureaucracy will not agree to it. So you come into the White House, you have good intentions, and the mid-level bureaucracy takes over Trump. And I think that's what happened. I don't deny
Yeah.
he had good intentions, but he just didn't have the cojones to say, you're fired to them. And from what I'm
Which is
seeing,
ironic because the
yeah,
guy built a career doing The Apprentice where he fired people.
exactly. And I think a lot of people on The Apprentice shouldn't have been fired, but a lot of people in the White House should have been fired. That's kind of the
Exactly.
irony of the situation. But it's obvious that even people who were inside, Peter Navarro, I mean, Doug McGregor, who was in there for some time.
Yeah.
I had a discussion on my podcast with Darren Beatty from Revolver News. He said the same thing. He was taken over. Unfortunately, there were a lot of forces around him, and he just didn't have the sort of intellectual recognition to know who's on his side, on the side of his agenda, and who's trying to screw him while pretending to be MAGA. But from Bobby seems to me a guy who really will get in there with a political minigun and just rip things apart because he's
And
proven.
actually drain the swamp.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think he does have it in his bones and in his blood, that tradition of Kennedy Democrat populism, that there are forces arrayed against you that you have to take over. So from what I'm seeing right now, and I hope he keeps up this pace.
Hmm.
He does have more fortitude and courage than Trump. From your personal experience, what do you think?
Well, my personal experience with Bobby is a whole other story because
Okay.
when I was talking to him about running for president back in 2008, he was a pretty different guy back then. He was what you'd call a good Democrat. He endorsed the orthodoxy of the Democratic Party. Like I said, he was endorsing Hillary Clinton and didn't endorse Barack Obama until after the convention when Obama was nominated. He was kind of slow to get on the Obama train, and he was loyal to Hillary. But some of his past positions I vehemently disagree with. I'm not going to lie. But he's evolved through the years. I guess you could say he's been red pilled on a few things. And I'll tell you a personal story about that. Back in 2008, I saw Bobby in Dallas, and he was speaking at a hotel very close to Dealey Plaza where President Kennedy was shot. Now, as far as I know, Bobby had never been to Dealey Plaza, had never visited that place. Kennedys usually just didn't go visit places like that. So I brought the subject up in conversation, and he was very unwilling to discuss the assassination of his uncle. He didn't want to talk about any conspiracies. And then soon thereafter, I became friends with Paul Schrade. If you know who Paul Schrade is,
Yes.
he was a former labor organizer on the Kennedy campaign in 1960. Then again in 1968, was working with the farm workers and Cesar Chavez, and was very close to Bobby, very good friend of Bobby's on that campaign. And he was in the Ambassador Hotel kitchen when the shots rang out, and he took a bullet to his head.
Yeah.
And survived, made a full recovery, and spent the rest of his life trying to get to the bottom of what actually happened to Senator Robert Kennedy that night at the Ambassador Hotel. Paul came to believe that Sirhan did not shoot Senator Kennedy. Now, Paul believed that Sirhan shot him. Sirhan shot like 5 people in the room. Paul was one of the 5. And he was trying to reach out to the Robert Kennedy family to bring them evidence that showed that Sirhan was not guilty. And pretty much every member of the family slammed the door on his nose, including Robert Kennedy's widow, Ethel. Most of their children didn't receive him or his information warmly, even though he was a close, trusted friend and confidant of their dad. There was this thing in the Kennedy family where they just wouldn't confront anything other than the official version of events. They endorsed the Warren Commission's findings on the JFK assassination publicly, completely. They believed that Sirhan was guilty of the murder of Robert Kennedy. And it's my understanding that that was because of Ted Kennedy, that was his wish. And as long as Teddy was alive, the family was going to stay quiet about such things.
Right.
So Paul Schrade reached out to me and said, "Hey, can you get this information package to Bobby about his father's murder?" And I said, "Dude, it doesn't look hopeful because he really doesn't want to talk about this, but I'll try." And so I was like this courier in between these 2 men, because Bobby didn't want his phone number and he didn't want to take his calls and he did not want to talk to Paul Schrade. And I kept working on him. I was like, "But Bobby, he's 83 years old. He's not going to live forever. He's devoted 40 years of his life to finding out the truth of what happened to your dad. Can't you at least have lunch with him when you're in LA or something like that?" Because Paul still lived in Los Angeles. Long story short, it took a few years before Bobby was ready to have that meeting with Paul Schrade. But once they finally sat down together and they talked, and Bobby looked at the autopsy and he listened to the Brzezinski recording and looked at the evidence. He's a good lawyer.
Yeah.
And he had to objectively say, there's no way Sirhan was guilty. And he's visited Sirhan in prison. He wrote a letter to the parole board last time Sirhan was up for parole, recommending his release. And the parole board agreed. And they were going to release Sirhan, but Governor Gavin Newsom of California put a stop to it. So Sirhan remains in prison. Now he's in his late 70s. He's been in prison for 55 years. 55 years. I don't know if he'll ever see the light of day.
It's I think in that recent podcast where well, it was a recording just after his announcement that Bobby did with those 2 guys who do
the Jackman brothers.
Yeah, the political impersonations.
We just had them on Strange Bedfellows last week.
Exactly. Yeah, be sure to check out also Strange Bedfellows, guys, on U.S. Tour of Duty, by the way. Great show. But they asked them about that. So you were the courier who actually sort of mediated between Bobby and him actually seeing finally the autopsy report. Wow, that's well,
I gave him Paul Schrade's phone number. Like, please call this man, please.
You heard it here on Votum TV, folks. That's wow, that's pretty impressive. It seems that wow, because
Paul just passed away last November. He lived to be a ripe old 97 before he passed away, and Paul was sharp as a tack to the end, and they forged a very special friendship. It was late in life, but when Bobby woke up and he and Paul became friends, they became very, very close friends. And I know that was special to Paul towards the end of his life. And Bobby actually spoke at his memorial, I think last month.
He was Bobby Kennedy's sort of unofficial, if I remember correctly, what Bobby Jr. called like his unofficial bodyguard, right? He was a former football player, because he was a pretty big guy.
Oh, was a big guy.
Yeah,
Big
yeah.
guy.
He's the one standing behind Bobby in the Ambassador Hotel with the glasses, I think,
Mhm.
to his right, just when he was announced, because that place was packed
That's right.
during that event. But wow, okay, well, certainly,
He's
definitely
a
a
good
deep
man.
dive.
I miss Paul Schrade. He was an amazing man.
He's buried in California. If I'm
I think so.
in California,
Yeah.
okay,
Los
interesting.
Angeles.
And the same, because Paul passed away, but also the guy who everybody suspects actually did Bobby
Mhm.
Sr. also passed away in the
Yeah.
Philippines, I believe. And
Yeah, in
Bobby,
2020, that
yeah,
was, Thane Eugene Caesar,
exactly,
the rent-a-cop, the security guard with suspicious intelligence connections who was standing right next to Senator Kennedy and had the best opportunity to deliver the fatal shot to his ear.
right.
Yeah.
Connected apparently with Langley at some point, and Boeing, and with
Yep.
visceral hatred for the
Lockheed.
Kennedy family. Lockheed, yeah,
Mhm. Yeah.
interesting. Um, how is the organization of the campaign looking, Lori? I mean, obviously, if you want to tackle the Democrat machine, especially, I think, because everybody says, "Oh, this is going to be a historical election," but I take caution with that, because everybody says every election's historical, but this one I think is really going to be historical. Like, this is
Mhm.
finally the one, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, how Biden's big theme is it's a battle for the soul of the nation.
Right.
I think this time it really is a
Yes.
battle for the soul of the nation to define what kind of nation the United States wants to be in the
Yeah.
21st century. Are we going to continue to be the bully of the whole world, or are we going to try and live up to our standard, our ideals?
You're on the precipice,
Mm.
basically. You're on the
Yeah,
precipice, and
it feels like it.
things definitely need to change. How would you assess the ground game going right now in the campaign and the organizational structures? You're seeing it as a volunteer. That's
Mm.
obviously something you're going to have. What's your assessment going forward of how well the organization of the campaign is going?
Well, it's just now getting off the ground,
Hmm.
and so it's pretty chaotic here in the beginning. And a lot of it is just, they're giving volunteers a lot of leeway. We don't feel like we're being micromanaged. They're pretty much just saying, go out there and spread the good word. And so we're kind of doing a lot of this on our own. There's been a lot. Our main focus right now is fundraising,
Right.
and we're doing phone banking and trying to raise funds because we're up against a machine that's got a hell of a lot more money than we do. Bobby is not going to take a lot of corporate money like other candidates. So this is going to have to be funded by the people.
Right.
And every $5 and donation really does count in a campaign like this one. And it's going to come from the grassroots. So that's what we're really focusing on now.
How does because if you were to get register as a Democrat again, how do the primaries look, particularly Democratic primaries in your state, in Oklahoma? Is there a big party machine controlling the situation? Is it more grassroots? How would you assess going forward the ground game in Oklahoma, particularly as it relates to the Democratic primary?
Well, I gotta tell you, here in Oklahoma, the Democratic Party does not have much power. We've been a solidly red state since the 80s. This is Trump country.
Right.
But as far as the Democratic primaries go, I think that Bobby has a really good chance of carrying our state. Um, I, People really don't like Joe Biden down here. I'll tell you that much. Even Democrats,
Okay.
they've had enough of this guy.
So I'm guessing in 2016, I didn't look at the maps because Rust Belt was sort of the center of attention for a lot of people. But I'm
Mhm.
guessing there was a lot of Democratic turnover, at least in 2016, Democrats for Trump in your state.
Believe it or not, Bernie Sanders won Oklahoma in the Super Tuesday
Oh,
primary in
okay. Right. You're
2016.
right. Right.
He
That
did.
I
That was
remember.
kind of a surprise, but
Hmm.
there's always been a pretty strong socialist element here in the heartland in Kansas, Oklahoma. And that goes back to the days of Woody Guthrie and the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. But our Democratic Party tends to be pretty far to the left
Hmm.
in the heartland of America. So when you look at it that way, it wasn't that much of a surprise that Bernie would win Oklahoma. He did really well here. I think Bobby will too.
Perfect. Well, he as I mentioned in our discussion before the talk, what makes him interesting, what makes me happy, is that Bobby, on his, not only is it campaigning, but he has time to do his podcast. And audience, if you recall, you can I think he has a Spotify site
Mhm.
also where you can check out Bobby's podcast. But he's interviewed people you've seen on our show and with
Mhm.
on Lori's show. Scott Ritter is one,
Yeah.
Colonel McGregor is one, and Ben Abelow, who wrote a very nice booklet about how the West provoked the war in Ukraine. So the more he's being pushed, the better people he's interviewing, and he's not backing down, which is great. Because
Yeah.
one of the things that I was kind of worried at the beginning that, and I noticed you pushing him in the right direction on Twitter, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people also did that. Some people believe he's kind of softening his approach to Fauci after writing such a great book and a takedown.
Mm.
But then he came back with another tweet. He's like, no, 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 obviously there has to be justice. So, yeah,
Yeah.
you have to keep him in the arena, so to say, and on point. But as long as he has that momentum going behind him, he's definitely going to. I think he prevails if things go in a just way, and they do have the primaries,
That's a
and
big if.
that's a big if. And
Mm.
if they have the debates, which they said they already won't have, but
Right.
it's kind of hard for me to imagine that there won't be a backlash if there's not a debate with Bobby still in the race. I mean, I don't think that'll go over well, just from a purely, I mean, even if there are sincere Biden voters who at least adhere to some notion of justice, going to say, yeah, but, I mean, we're
But
talking
have
about
a
democracy.
debate.
Let's have a debate.
Right.
Exactly. Why not?
Mhm.
Um, how do you see the, Watergate literally defending themselves and saying, no, we're not going to debate? I mean, what arguments can they use that'll
All they
persuade
can
people?
say is what they're saying now is they can say, well, he's the incumbent president and we don't have to
Hmm.
because, it's just kind of the tradition that usually an incumbent president doesn't have any challengers. And so there usually aren't any debates on that side. And, my advice to Bobby, and he wouldn't like it much, is that he should switch parties. He should get the hell out of the Democratic Party because the process is rigged. He's not going to get he's not going to get a chance to debate. He's not going to get a chance to have a fair primary. We all saw what they did to Bernie Sanders twice. It's not going to be a fair convention because of super delegates. And I feel like if he really wants to win the White House, his values are honestly would be more welcome in the Republican Party today. The Democratic Party today hates Bobby Kennedy and everything that he stands for. He's really not compatible with the Democratic Party of today as it currently stands. I know he wants to restore it to the old Kennedy Democrat tradition. That's an admirable goal. I wish he could do that. I just don't think it's really possible in the Democratic Party. I personally feel like his best path would be to change parties, to become a Republican, then he could debate.
Right.
Then he would have a much better chance at the nomination because they don't have super delegates in the Republican Party. And Trump is kind of vulnerable
Hmm.
right now. There are many MAGA Republicans, many that I know, who really like Kennedy, and they're seriously giving him a look and thinking about voting for him, at least in the primaries, if he runs as a Democrat. And if he ran Republican, he might just get the nomination away from Trump.
Well, if you're seeing the dynamic which we saw in 2016, maybe not so much in 2020, but I mean, all the old Democratic Party values went in 2016 in essence to Trump. I mean,
Right.
the whole Rust
Mhm.
Belt, the former Reagan Democrats, and so on.
Exactly.
I think even segments of
Yeah.
what Nixon captured with his campaign in '68. The Southern strategy
Yeah.
connected with the Northern Catholics and so on. I mean, those were all Democrats, right? But
Yep. And two of Trump's, biggest helpers in the 2016 campaign, Steve Bannon and Rudy Giuliani, were both Kennedy Democrats
yeah,
in their youth. Giuliani grew up idolizing JFK and RFK. That's the reason he wanted to be a federal prosecutor was because of Robert Kennedy. So he idolized Bobby's dad.
yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the old Kennedy Democrats that used to support Trump jump ship and support Bobby.
Indeed, and Bannon never even he doesn't hide the fact. In every documentary that we watch, and how he talks about his growing up in Virginia, that
Mhm.
his whole family were all Democrats, because that's where Catholics used to go for their votes. Especially
Of
the
course.
ethnics, the Irish, the entire northern and the East Coast. Things have
Right.
changed, obviously, but yeah, I would agree with that. Politically, that wouldn't be such a bad move. Maybe not at this stage, because that'd be too
Mm.
surprising. But I mean, going forward, you still have some time before things really begin to move forward. It would be a wise consideration, because I think going independent would sort of move him away from the sympathies of a lot of Republicans who, as you said, would say, "No, Bobby, we want you in our tent. We want you here, not outside. Come on in."
Yeah,
So
that's
I,
right. And
I,
unfortunately, I mean, I'm an independent too. I wish that an independent could win the
right,
White House. Unfortunately, it's just not possible because it's hard to get ballot access in all 50 states. It's impossible to get on a debate stage when you're third party or independent. That's all rigged. I mean, it's pretty much rigged in favor of the two-party system, which is why our good friend, Dr. Ron Paul, even though he's a libertarian in his heart, he had to run with the Republican Party and be in
right.
the Republican Party in order to win elections. And I'm afraid, sadly, that is still the case. If he was going to run with one of the two parties, I strongly feel he would have a more fair shake in the Republican Party.
Yep, indeed. And as another populist tribune and hero, Pat Buchanan learned the hard
Mm.
way in the year
Yep.
2000, running as a reform candidate.
Yes,
And
he did.
actually, and Pat came back to the Republican Party after, but only in a way to sort of sow the seeds of Trumpism after. Lori, we have
Mhm.
one question today so far from Trid. He said, Mike, can you please ask Lori? I know if it's sort of a rhetorical question, but is it possible to take the corporate money out of U.S. politics in our lifetime? Lori, Mission
Mm.
Impossible, even
Citizens
with Bobby in the White
United.
House.
Yeah,
Hmm.
Citizens United kind of makes that a moot point
Hmm.
nowadays. Yeah, and, you know, how how does a candidate win the White House if they're not taking big corporate dollars? That's another question I have for Bobby is how do you beat this system that's so deeply, firmly entrenched? That's just how American politics is done. Can a people-funded, crowd-funded candidate really win? That remains to be seen. And that's another reason he needs to run with one of the two big parties,
Yeah.
because that party apparatus and the fundraising, and he needs that, especially if he's not going to take corporate money. Trump did it, but Trump had a substantial fortune of his own in 2016 and was financing much of his own campaign.
And he still took money, though. And he still took money.
Yes, he did. He did. He took $1
Yeah.
million from Pfizer. I
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
tell you that.
I remember in October, I think 2015, he was mocking Marco Rubio for being Sheldon
Mm,
Adelson's poodle.
right.
And then what did you do, Donald, in the White House with the Sheldon
He
Adelson
worked with
family?
Sheldon
I,
Adelson.
I, I was so hopeful at the time, because I said, finally, somebody's calling out, these Israel firsters in American politics. And Sheldon was a beast in that regard. I mean, this is a guy who said we should detonate a nuclear bomb over Iran just to prove a point. And I said,
Yeah.
finally, somebody's going after him. And then I find out, oh, why, Donald, why?
And
So
then you
it's
saw that policy playing out in his dealings with
un-
Israel, during his
unfortunately,
presidency.
the embassy and so on. But yeah,
Nobody
you're
loves
right.
Israel more than I do. Nobody. I'm the Israel guy.
Yeah,
You know.
exactly. And then complaining that I'm doing so much for Israel, but American Jews still don't like me. They're still voting Democrat. Well, Donald, there are other dynamics at play here, so to say, right? But yeah, it's interesting. But I think Bobby is, and the interesting angle with the Kennedys also is, and your friend Jim DiEugenio brings it
Mm.
up in Oliver Stone's latest doc on the revisitation, sort of the
JFK
assassination.
Revisited. Great
Yep.
film. Great film.
Which, with JFK actually being the only American president who tried to stop the Dimona nuclear plant in Israel.
That's right.
So, and obviously Johnson reversed that entire policy after. So, yeah, if we're talking about America first, who knows if in that regard, JFK might not have been the last America first president in relation to the Middle East and Israeli politics.
Good point.
Um, Here we have a comment from Emoji, who says that more Republicans And Democrats would vote independent before voting their duopoly twin.
Hmm. If they had the chance to, I believe they would.
Yeah.
And in so many states, it's very hard to vote for a third party or independent candidate. I lived in Texas for 25 years, and we couldn't even, and in Oklahoma, Ralph Nader couldn't get on the ballot here in Oklahoma. The Libertarian Party fought for years to get ballot access in Oklahoma and only got it in 2016. So third party and independent candidates, it's just such a hard road, and in some states impossible to get ballot access. He would have to be like a write-in candidate in some states.
Right.
It's a hard road. Hard
So
road.
if we're talking about Bobby still, okay, let's assume he wins the nomination of whichever party. Um, and since you're forming a sort of shadow cabinet here,
Hmm.
who are we going to put on the VP, Lori? Then
Oh boy.
so
I
much,
think
so
about
much to
that a
choose
lot.
from.
Well, you know who my dream VP would be is
Mhm.
Tulsi Gabbard. I'm
Yep.
a Tulsi girl. I love her. I think she'd be a great complement to Bobby, and she's got, congressional experience. She's got military experience. She's got incredible wisdom for her age, and I think, my dream would be to have her as vice president, and after 8 years of Kennedy, we'd have a President Tulsi Gabbard. Mhm.
That would be a welcome change from Kamala Harris right now.
Oh,
We would say
yes.
we can do better. We have women. We have intelligent women. We have women who
Mm.
put America first. No, that'd be interesting. I mean, Tulsi has been a star for a long time. Also, a big fan base here in Poland. I've seen even films with her with Polish translations on YouTube and other social media outlets. But yeah, that would definitely be an interesting ticket
It'd
with
be
Kennedy
awkward
and
for
Tulsi.
her, though, coming back to the Democratic Party after she left. She made a big show out of, leaving the Democrats, so she'd have
Yeah,
to come back. I don't know if she'll do that.
and then Tucker Carlson for White House spokesperson. I'm
Oh,
guessing.
oh, wow. Ooh, that'd be cool.
So I mean,
Well,
we can
Tucker makes
go.
too much money to do a job like that, though.
Well, it depends where your loyalties, right? Some people say it's all
Yeah,
about the Benjamins. Some people say it's about America, which I hope they all are good politicians have their countries in their hearts. But
good point.
if
Good
I were to
point.
go forward, I mean, so I'm taking this cabinet. You have Bobby, you have Tulsi, you have
Mm,
Tucker as the spokesperson, and then obviously we have Scott Ritter and Doug McGregor in the Pentagon making policy or in the State Department. I
mhm.
mean, wow,
That's right.
the opportunities for
Mhm,
peace, so great, so great. One of the reasons why a lot of you may be asking why a guy in Poland is so interested in American politics and RFK, well, let me tell you why. Because we are literally on the front line of a potential war with Russia. Our politicians in Warsaw are neocon, completely neocon, and the only way, the reason why I'm sort of pushing this America-centric theme on my shows is because what happens in Washington will reverberate deeply in Warsaw, whether we like it or not. That's why it's in our national interest, to all the Polish audience out there, that we need a sensible peace candidate in the White House who's not going to push us towards a war with Russia and then basically to leave us to die as all the Western allies did in World War II. So let's not make the
mhm,
same mistake again, guys. The less warmongering the candidate, the better. It's not 1980. It's not Ronald Reagan warning in America. Times are changed. It's Russia, not the Soviet Union. So I think the more the Polish audience gets interested and sends these vibes to a potential candidate and to Bobby that, hey, we're for you in the sense that, yeah,
mhm,
what you got to do in America is your business, but your foreign policy takes us away from the precipice of war with Russia, then you have our support also. That I think I needs to be said, because I did the same thing in 2016. People were asking, why the hell are you so interested in the Trump? I mean, what does Trump have to do with Poland? I'm like, well, he has a lot to do with Poland, because depending on if he has a successful summit with Putin or not, that'll
mhm.
determine our entire foreign policy for the next 4 years. So
At least.
at
At
least,
least.
at least, unless we
Mhm,
untangle ourselves from the American web and look more realistically at the world and align with the multipolarity that's rising. But since
mm.
we are so interconnected with Washington, the character and the foreign policy line of the candidates for president should be very important to every poll currently. Um,
Especially polls of military age, because
yes,
you guys are gonna be next on the front lines when Ukraine runs out of men.
indeed. As a matter of fact, there is a book which has just been released by two great authors. One is a friend of mine, Mr. Tomasz Budzyński. This is specifically for the Polish audience, and Wojciech Sumliński, one of Poland's great investigative reporters, sort of like our Cy Hirsch. And in that book, apart from my comments, which they quote extensively, there is an unclassified report from the equivalent of our FBI, the ABW Security Service, where they talk about the potential of a Polish-Ukrainian union, which a lot of people are talking about openly. Apparently, there's a treaty being worked out, and our current political leadership is already saying that they've changed tones in the last 2 months. They said, okay, yeah, Ukraine is not going to win this, so we might have to agree to a hard compromise. And part of this hard compromise is building a Polish-Ukrainian entity. This is being apparently seriously discussed between Warsaw and Kiev as an anti-Russian bulwark. Now, combining Poland with all our problems, with the corrupt hellhole that is Ukraine, is going to swamp us. And anybody who doesn't see it is blind. This is something we need to take seriously. And I think this is one of those things that we need to communicate also to, the American audience and to American voters, that this is not in our interest. Please do everything you can or bring this issue up, because at the end of the day, a Polish-Ukrainian union state aimed against Russia brings nuclear war closer, not further, because the ideology behind it is to be, the character of this union state is to be anti-Russian and not some neutral, Western Ukrainian Polish state. But I got a little bit ahead of myself. Lori, let's get back to the States.
Yeah, that kind of scares me because, historically speaking, the Poles and the Ukrainians have a very complicated relationship.
To say the least. I hail from southeastern Poland. Trust me, I know, I have personal family experience of what Banderites did to people there during World War II and after World War II, and how families were literally split up because, for example, somebody in the family was hiding a Jew in a barn, and the cousin, for example, was in the UPA, in the Ukrainian nationalist movements. And after years, somebody would say to somebody, you know what, if I knew you were hiding that Jewish woman in the barn, I would kill you without hesitation, because loyalty to the idea is much more important to me than family. That's how sick the dynamics worked at that time in southeastern Poland and what is now Western Ukraine, Volhynia, which thankfully Scott Ritter talks about a lot, and not only Scott, but over 100,000 people massacred in ways you can't imagine even. So
unfortunately, I was just watching that episode of The Unknown War the other night, and I saw the films.
Right.
Yeah.
If you get a chance, it's obviously a lot of fictionalized aspects to it, but it does relate to a historical event. There's a movie by Wojciech Smarzowski. I think you can find it with English subs, which was in theaters about 3 years ago. It's called Volhynia, or Wołyń in Polish, and talks about a Polish-Ukrainian couple being divided by the entire situation after 1943. So highly recommend it. It's pretty bloody, so rated R. Don't watch it with your children, but you'll get a feel for what happened with the guys who later hooked up with the CIA for the entire duration of the Cold War, and then came out in 2014 in force after that famous call between.
That's right. Yeah, I've been writing about that a hell of a lot this past year because I'm desperately trying to wake up my fellow Americans to the real history. I mean, some of my fellow Americans get the fact that this war didn't start in February of 2022. They know the history, at least of the Maidan coup, and they know that it dates back over about a decade. But a lot of them, I'd say most of them, just don't know that this love affair between the CIA and the Nazis in Ukraine actually started practically as soon as World War II was over in 1945. It even predates the CIA. It was military intelligence that was recruiting a lot of these guys. And then when the CIA was founded in 1947, Allen Dulles just welcomed those Ukrainian Nazis into his loving arms and started, arming them, funding them, using them for guerrilla warfare to effect regime change in the Soviet Union. And by the way, that whole program was an utter and complete failure.
Right.
The CIA is not proud of their work in Ukraine for a few decades there, because all their agents that they placed into the Soviet Union were quickly captured by the Soviets, and most of them were executed. And of course, the Soviets killed Stefan Bandera in 1959.
Yeah, and a lot of I mean, the fundamental question is why did they kill him in Munich? What was he doing in Munich, right?
What
So
was he doing in
who was
Munich?
protecting him in Munich? So
I know the
you
answer
know,
to that.
he wasn't in Warsaw, he wasn't in Moscow, he was there, he wasn't in Kiev. Yeah,
Yep.
you're right. In essence, what we're seeing is being played out. It's like failed CIA Ukrainian Operation Part 2, like hotshots, right? But
Like they think
unfortunately,
it's going to work better this time.
yeah. Well, it's yeah, the CIA. Lori, going back to JFK, and you've done great work on the assassination research with Jim DiEugenio. I saw the podcast on the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, thank
Really
you. You're
great
welcome.
stuff. Highly recommended. What new aspects ever since Trump released the documents? Obviously, not all the documents, but there were some interesting snippets in them. What new things have we learned that those documents possibly contributed to about Oswald, about Jan Cana, about Chicago, the Cubans, anything that before, for example, 2017 wasn't so obvious to the average researcher? What can you comment on that?
I'm still pouring through documents that were released in 2017, 2018, because there were thousands and thousands and thousands of them. It's been enough to keep researchers occupied. And everyone's got their little field of expertise, their niche that they're interested in. But I think the most stunning revelation, at least to me, that came out of I think it was the 2018 document dump, was that the mayor of Dallas, Earl Cabell, was the brother of Charles Cabell at the CIA, who was involved in all the anti-Castro Cuban operations. He was fired by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs.
Right.
So he was an enemy of President Kennedy. And it just so happened that the mayor of Dallas, Texas, on November 22nd, 1963, was his brother, Earl Cabell. Now, we knew that. But what we didn't know until it was confirmed in a document that was finally declassified 5 years ago was that Earl Cabell was also CIA. He was a CIA agent. And that's troubling for a lot of reasons. As mayor of Dallas, Earl Cabell would have had a lot of say in the motorcade route.
Right.
He had a lot to do with that. And the cover up, of course, because he would have had control over the police department. And it's also just troubling that an active CIA agent was the mayor of a major American city. And it makes you wonder, how many politicians are we going to find out 50 years from now, 60 years from now? How many of our current politicians are we going to find out later are actually CIA agents? Makes you wonder.
Indeed, it's sort of like the Freemasons. You find out after they're dead only that they were Freemasons.
That's right. That's right.
It's an interesting development. I've noticed because obviously I know, and I'm pretty sure among our audience, a lot of people follow Cy Hirsch's work. And I wanted to ask you this for about a week now, because I've noticed Jim DiEugenio did a long essay, an expose on some of the things that Cy got wrong in his reporting on Camelot. Now, I want to disassociate this.
Don't get me started. You want to get me started?
I want to get you started. Exactly. So let's
right.
not talk about pipelines right now getting blown up. That's a different story.
That's another story.
A lot of people do think that Cy's Camelot, the dark side was really revisionist history, but it was factual. It was based on facts. I'm just beginning, and I'm a historian by trade. I'm slowly looking into all of these things. But for our audience, can you just flesh out the main points that Jim pointed out where Cy just completely got it wrong on JFK? Or at least some of the main points, or one main.
I'll give you a few points.
Yeah.
What bothered me about the dark side of Camelot is that Cy Hirsch, this could also tie into his Nord Stream reporting. Cy has a lot of sources that he taps inside the CIA, the intelligence community. And since 1963, there's been a variety of cover stories, what I would call false sponsors in spy jargon, for the Kennedy assassination. There's the Castro did it theory. There's the
Right.
mob did it theory. There's the Lyndon Johnson did it theory. And they're all kind of meant to distract you. Look over here, look over there. Just don't look at the CIA,
Yeah.
right? Look anywhere but here at the CIA. Unfortunately, though, the sources that Cy uses for a lot of his work are agency people who often feed him malarkey stories, which he then prints as the gospel. And many of his stories in The Dark Side of Camelot, specifically involving the Castro plots, are just
Mhm.
balderdash. They're straight out of the agency talking points. And
Just to interdict,
Mhm.
Castro plots that were apparently initiated by the Kennedys, right?
Mm, no,
The-
that's where I
the-
would disagree.
no, no. The question is, does Psy frame it in that regard? That
Oh,
it was,
yes,
yeah,
he
he's
frames
framing
it
it
that
as,
way.
yeah,
He
yeah, yeah.
tries to
Okay.
blame
Mhm.
it on Bobby
Right,
Kennedy and Jack
right,
Kennedy, that they were trying to kill Fidel Castro.
right.
But the evidence just doesn't add up. You see that it's exactly the opposite. You see, especially in the last few months of the Kennedy presidency, there were many efforts being made, back channel efforts to calm the tensions with Cuba and with the Soviet Union, which of course upset the CIA greatly because these were their pet projects. Kennedy pissed off all the right people. And one of those people was Alan Dulles, who I believe is, Kennedy's probably real killer. Not the guy who pulled the trigger,
Right.
but the guy who ran the operation ultimately.
What do you think? I'm reading a book right now. It's called The Ghost. It's about James Jesus Angleton.
Angleton, right.
Yes.
Mhm.
And as a matter of fact, I came off watching also an interesting series. It's called A Spy Among Friends, where Angleton is portrayed as this American, well, he
Mhm.
was an American head of operations at CIA, but he was a good friend of Ken Philby. And this series deals, I think it's a 6-part miniseries. You can find it online. I think it's on HBO. Whereby Angleton was a good friend of Philby's. Philby obviously did what he did. He defected to the Soviet Union. Angleton was apparently very angered by this. To the end of his life, he devoted to finding the one mole in the CIA, which he couldn't find,
Yes.
but apparently was always there. But there's a if Dulles, I mean, I have no doubt to believe, it seems would be the godfather of the plot, used his position to liquidate Kennedy. I'm pretty sure Angleton would have had a hand in this
Mm.
because Angleton knew everything and everyone. In that book, The Ghost, by the way, I forgot the author's name right now. But it's a really deep dive into a very peculiar figure in American history. Have you seen any, or what from your perspective, any information about Angleton being involved in all of this?
Oh,
What are you
sure.
hearing? Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I must say that Angleton is not my particular wheelhouse, my field of expertise on the case. I think there are probably other researchers who could give you a better
Hmm.
picture of what his role in this thing was, but he was definitely in that inner circle of what I would call sort of rogue CIA,
Right.
who despised Kennedy, despised his foreign policy, felt that he had to be stopped at all costs. And they certainly had plenty of practice in the assassinations department, right? They had
Yeah.
taken out several leaders of other countries. It is certainly not beyond the realm of possibility or imagination that they could have just as easily have taken out our president. They had every means, motive, and opportunity to do it.
Lori, another interesting thread that you put out there related to a book written by your current Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. I
Mm.
think it was in the late 80s. If you could
Mhm.
just bring our audience up to speed on what was written in that book by Anthony Blinken and why it's relevant today, because I think that's a very interesting topic.
Well, it is, and it's a really interesting story. I'll try to give you the short version. A lot of people don't realize, or they might not be old enough to remember, that the Nord Stream pipeline wasn't the first time that the United States had sabotaged and blown up a Russian natural gas pipeline headed from Russia to Europe. We did this before, back in 1982, We sabotaged the Trans-Siberian pipeline, which was carrying natural gas to Europe. And of course, much like with Nord Stream, there was a great political back and forth between Europe and the United States and NATO, specifically about doing business with Russia and letting Russia have control over that much of their energy market. We were trying to get in the middle of that, drive a wedge between our NATO allies and the Soviet Union at that time. So yeah, we literally blew up that pipeline. At the time, it was the largest non-nuclear explosion on planet Earth in history. It was huge. Fortunately, no one was killed. It was out in the middle of remote Siberia. But it was sending a message to the Soviets that we can destroy your vital infrastructure and your economic lifeline to Europe. And then we did it again. We pretty much followed the exact same playbook, 40 years later in 2022 in last September, when I believe we sabotaged the Nord Stream pipeline. So what do those two events have in common? What's the connecting thread? It's a guy named Antony Blinken, who's our current Secretary of State. Back in 1987, he wrote a book about the Trans-Siberian pipeline and the international kerfuffle over that. And the book was called Ally versus Ally. And it was actually his college thesis. He was like a international law student at Harvard when he wrote that. And I guess the foreign policy wonks saw something special in this young man. They thought he had his finger on the pulse. So they gave him a book deal and they published his college thesis as a book. And it's a pretty rare book today, but you can still find it. You can read it free at the Internet Archive. And it's a really interesting read. Once you see what just happened with Nord Stream, you kind of go,
Anthony Boom Boom Blinken, or Anthony Pipeline like Go Bye Bye Blinken. Yes.
He's such a liar.
Yeah, such a liar. He is. I think right now, Ray McGovern makes the point that, the best and brightest. I even think during the Vietnam War, those guys were more best and more brightest than the current crop that you're seeing in the White House, which Good can point. Be compared to Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Sullivan, Blinken, and Newland, in essence.
Wink and Blinken and nod.
Wink and Blinken.
That's what I call them.
Exactly. Yeah. No, this was a really good deep dive. I'm happy to have you on our show today, Lori. I know we've got an hour. I was just wondering.
Are we out of time already? That was a fast hour.
We still got a couple of minutes, but
I'm enjoying this.
I know some of our audience is enjoying this. As a matter of fact, we have a comment here also from an eccentric uncle. This live stream is perfect preparation for my family gathering tomorrow. Thank you, Komoji. Excellent. It's all about building networks and communities. And we also have a comment from Schrade. I think this is in relation to the Kennedy assassination. He says, and don't look at Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay.
There you go.
The one who apparently said during the Cuban Missile Crisis, "You're in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President." And JFK responded, "Well, in case you haven't noticed, you are in it with me."
So are you.
Exactly.
You're right there with me.
Yeah. LeMay, by the way, he was George Wallace's VP candidate, right?
He sure was.
A couple of years later, I remember. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You have a good memory.
Combination that was. In terms, maybe just going back to the Republican side for now, because I just want to get your projection. Do you think Ron DeSanctimonious, as many call him, is going to run, or has he finally realized that with all of Trump's faults notwithstanding, he doesn't have a chance? What's your reading of the situation?
Everyone, all my Republican friends who are connected keep telling me, Ron's going to run. Wait for it. He's going to run. Any minute now, he's going to announce his candidacy. I had several tell me he was going to announce last week. And again, it didn't happen. Every time they say it's going to happen, it doesn't happen. If he's wise, he'll stay out of this race. I kind of feel like DeSantis is the just in case candidate.
Right.
Just in case Trump goes to prison, or just in case, Trump falls on his face. There's always those just in case candidates because the Republican Party really doesn't like Donald Trump. The party apparatus You know, they hated him in 2016. He had to do a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. The neocons running the party detested him. And they still do. And they would probably love to have someone else this time as their nominee. I think they feel like Trump's just got too much baggage. He brings too much scandal with him. They're not looking forward to another 4 or 8 year presidency where he's getting impeached every year and a half and, you know, dragging the country through one scandal after another. I think that Republicans have the same fatigue with Donald Trump as Democrats did with Bill Clinton.
Right.
By the end of Clinton's 8 years, it was just like, oh God, please no more of this. This guy is just nothing but one scandal after another. So if they had a better option, they might just take it. But I don't think DeSantis is that man. He doesn't have the charisma. He doesn't have the likability that Trump does to his followers. I just don't think that DeSantis has got it. I'm sure he'd love to be Trump's VP. Maybe Trump would select him as a running mate.
From my personal vantage point, kind of hard to see after the back and forth between them. But who knows?
Well, yeah,
These things happen.
But
these
you
things
remember,
happen.
yeah, I mean, the one guy that Trump didn't fight with of all his challengers back in 2016 was Mike Pence. So he chose Mike Pence.
Right.
Trump likes a yes man.
Yeah.
As his backup. And I don't think he wants a guy like Bobby Kennedy. You know, Roger Stone was floating the idea that we could have a Trump Kennedy unity ticket. Well, and Bobby just threw cold water on that one the other day.
After he threw cold water on that one, Bannon on his Getter account said, "Oh, we'll come back in a year. We'll see what you're saying." So,
did he really? I didn't see that.
He did. So come back in a year, Bobby, and we'll see what's happening.
Because apparently,
apparently, Bannon was also the one who actually brought him initially to meet with Trump at Bedminster, I think, when they were considering him for the
Vaccine
Safety Commission, right? So I think that old Democrat awoke in Bannon. That obviously, unfortunately, didn't materialize. But it was a pretty interesting comment. We'll see what happens in a year. But you know what? I mean, let's
never say never in politics.
Never say never in politics. And I mean, you have Ron DeSantis, but let's not forget, you also have the sage in the person of Nikki Haley. Let's not forget about Nikki Haley. What's she running at? 0.03%.
Everybody forgot about her already.
Exactly. Poor old Nikki out there trying to make a point, trying to resurrect neoconservatism in 2023. Wow. People are really detached from reality in that aspect. But
yeah, they are.
It's good to see some are grounded. Lori is grounded, as audience you can see. Bobby is grounded. I hope I'm grounded. And we'll see where things move forward. Lori, thank you so much for taking the time to the hearing. The stream was pretty good. Your roof isn't perfect to interfere in.
I just hope that my internet wasn't cutting in and out. I hope you guys could understand me okay.
I don't know that in there, but I think we got the message across. Tap the like button, give us a subscription, and I hope to see you all soon and Lori on our program. Have a good day, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, you guys.